I am Nyla Rivers. I survived a seemingly perfect marriage built on control and silence. By speaking the truth and standing with my daughter, I reclaimed my voice, my freedom, and our future. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe. Get ready for real emotional and thrilling stories from Black adults that will keep you hooked till the end. My name is Nyla Rivers. For years, I lived inside a story that looked flawless from the outside. I was a Black mother raising a bright little girl married to a man the world admired. People called him dependable, charismatic, even inspirational. They said I was lucky. They said our family was strong. What they didn't know was how carefully that story had been written by him, my husband. Darius Blackwell knew how to command a room without raising his voice. He carried power the way some men carry cologne subtle. Expensive, unforgettable. Confidence followed him like a shadow, and charm was his favorite weapon. When he smiled, people listened. When he spoke, doors opened. And when he looked at me in public, with his hand resting gently on my back, strangers saw love. They never saw fear. I remember the early days clearly. Darius wasn't cruel then. He was attentive, protective, and impossibly calm. He asked questions about my day, insisted on walking me to my car, and reminded me to lock the doors. When he said things like, "I just worry about you," I believed him. When he said, "I want to take care of everything so you don't have to stress," I felt grateful. I thought that was the partnership. I didn't notice when taking care. Slowly turned into control. Our daughter, Eleni Rivers, was born into that illusion. She became the center of my universe the moment I held her. Eleni had eyes that noticed everything, quiet, thoughtful eyes. She was gentle but observant, the kind of child who listened more than she spoke. To me, she was breath and heartbeat combined, my reason. My strength. To the world, Darius was an excellent father. He attended school events, smiled for photos, and spoke proudly about his daughter's future. Teachers praised his involvement. Neighbors admired his dedication. He knew exactly when to show up and what to say, but behind closed doors, the air felt different. There were rules in our home, though no one ever called them that. Certain topics were avoided. Certain questions were unwelcome. I learned quickly which opinions would start arguments and which silences would keep the peace. When disagreements happened, Darius didn't yell. He didn't have to. He would go quiet, calculated. His words sharp enough to cut without leaving a mark. "You're overthinking," he'd say. "That's not what happened. You're remembering it wrong." At first, I doubted myself. Then I stopped trusting my own memory altogether. People often ask how someone intelligent ends up trapped in a situation like that. The truth is, it doesn't feel like a trap at first. It feels like a compromise, like love, like choosing harmony over conflict. And by the time you realize the walls are closing in, you've already helped build them. From the outside, our life was polished. Family photos lined the hallway. Holidays were celebrated on time, smiles perfectly rehearsed. Darius liked appearances. He liked order. He liked being admired. And I played my part well because I believed protecting the image meant protecting my daughter. But Eleni felt the tension long before I admitted it existed. She grew quieter as the years passed. She watched more. She asked fewer questions at the dinner table. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at her father, not with fear exactly, but with caution, as if she were trying to understand a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. At night, she held my hand longer than necessary. She slept lightly, waking. At the sound of footsteps in the hallway, children sense what adults deny. There were moments, small, unsettling moments, when I realized something was wrong. A bank statement I didn't recognize. A decision was made without my knowledge. A conversation that ended with me apologizing, even though I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong. Each time, Darius had an explanation. And each explanation sounded reasonable enough to silence my doubts, reasonable enough to keep me quiet. Everyone thought our family was strong because it looked unbreakable. But strength built on silence is fragile. It cracks quietly. It collapses slowly. And inside our home, truth wasn't just unwelcome, it was dangerous. I didn't understand that yet. I still believed love could fix what honesty threatened to expose. I didn't know then that the most perfect lies are the ones we live inside. Every day. At the beginning, Darius's control didn't feel like control at all. It felt like care. It felt like security. It felt like the kind of attention people told me I deserved. "I just want to protect you." he would say, his voice calm, almost reassuring. You worry too much, let me handle things. And I let him. When he offered to manage our finances, I didn't question it. He was good with numbers, organized, and confident. I told myself it was practical, that marriages were about teamwork. He said it made sense for one person to be in charge, and he made it sound logical, even generous. I signed where he pointed. I trusted what he explained. I didn't think to ask what he didn't. That was the first door I closed on myself. Soon. After little things began to change. Darius asked for access to my bank accounts just in case. He said it was important for emergencies. When my phone buzzed, he'd glance at the screen, casually at first, like it meant nothing. If I stepped outside to take a call, he'd ask who it was, not accusing, just curious. Always curious. You don't need secrets from your husband. He'd say with a smile. I started explaining myself before he even asked. He questioned my choices gently, wrapping doubt and concern. If I wanted to visit a friend, he'd remind me how busy the week was. If I talked about going back to school or changing jobs, he'd list all the risks. He never said no outright. He didn't have to. By the end of every conversation, my ideas felt unrealistic, irresponsible, even selfish, and somehow I agreed with him. I told myself this was marriage, compromise, sacrifice, maturity. I told myself that strong women didn't need to prove anything. That trusting your husband was a virtue. That love meant letting someone lead when they claimed to know the way. What I didn't realize was how quietly my world was shrinking. I stopped making decisions without running them by Darius first. I delayed purchases until he approved them. I ignored the discomfort in my chest when he corrected me in front of others or dismissed my opinions with a laugh. Every time I felt uneasy, I told myself I was being sensitive. He never raised his voice. He never left bruises. He never looked like a villain that made it harder to see what he was taking. Eleni noticed before I did. She asked once why Daddy always knew where Mommy was. She asked why I always looked at my phone before answering it. I laughed it off, told her adults had responsibilities. But the question stayed with me, heavy and unanswered. Then came the moment that cracked the illusion. It started with the mail. A plain envelope, my name printed neatly on the front. Inside was a notice, formal, cold, official. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The words didn't make sense. Accounts, balances, amounts, IDN, single quotes, T recognized, debt, my name was on it. I sat at the kitchen table reading it again and again, waiting for clarity to appear. It didn't. My hands trembled as I opened more letters. Different lenders, different dates, all addressed to me. Allorelically binding. I felt the room tilt. I confronted Darius that night, holding the papers like evidence in a trial. He barely glanced at them before sighing, as if I disappointed him. I was going to tell you, he said. You wouldn't have understood. I was protecting you from stress. Protecting me. That word again. He explained it smoothly, confidently, turning my panic into inconvenience. He said it was temporary, strategic, necessary. He said couples shared responsibilities, and this was part of building a future. When I questioned why I hadn't been informed, his tone shifted, not angry, just firm. You trust me, don't you? I wanted to say no, but I didn't, because by then trust wasn't a choice. It was something I'd been trained to give. That night, I lay awake listening to Eleni breathe softly in her room, my mind racing. I realized something terrifying, not just that my name carried debts I never agreed to, but that I no longer knew where my life ended, and Darius's control began. Love wasn't supposed to feel like confusion. Protection wasn't supposed to. Erase you. And for the first time, I wondered if what I had been calling marriage was something else entirely. Eleni changed in ways that were easy to overlook if you weren't her mother. There was no sudden rebellion, no dramatic outbursts, just small shifts, quiet ones. She laughed less. She thought more. And when she did speak, her words carried a weight that didn't belong to a child her age. She'd always been observant, but now it was different. She watched people the way adults do, as if she were studying them, measuring what they said against what they meant. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at Darius when he thought no one was looking. Not with anger, not even fear. With caution. That prayed me more than tears ever could. At night, her sleep grew restless. She woke up suddenly, eyes wide, breathing fast, as if she'd been running in a dream she couldn't escape. When I rushed into her room, she'd cling to me, her small hands gripping my shirt like she was afraid I might disappear. She started listening for footsteps. The sound of Darius's voice in the hallway made her go still. Not hiding, freezing, as if movement itself might attract attention. I noticed how quickly she straightened when he entered her room, how carefully she chose her words around him. She was learning rules I had never taught her, and that broke something inside me, I told myself. She was just sensitive. Children go through phases. That stress in adults sometimes spills into the atmosphere of a home. I made excuses because facing the truth felt too dangerous. Because admitting something was wrong meant admitting I hadn't protected her, but children don't imagine fear out of nothing. They absorb it. They learn it. One evening, after Darius had gone to bed, Eleni climbed into my room. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for anything. She just lay beside me in the dark, her back pressed against my arm, listening to my breathing. As if it anchored her. After a long silence, she took my hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice steady but small. "Daddy doesn't tell the truth." I felt my chest tighten. I didn't answer right away. I was afraid of what she might say next. Afraid that once the words were spoken, there would be no turning back. I squeezed her hand, trying to sound calm, trying to sound like a mother who had everything under control. "What makes you think that?" I asked. She turned to face me. In the dim light, her eyes looked older than they should have. "He says different things to different people," she said. "He makes them believe what he wants." I held my breath. "He tells teachers one story." She continued. "He tells you another. And when I ask him about it, he says I'm confused." The word hit me hard. Confused. It was the same word he used with me. My heart started to race as I realized what she was describing. Not lies in the obvious sense, not shouting or threats, but something quieter, something deliberate. The kind of truth that changes depending on who's listening. The kind that leaves you doubting your own memory. "How do you know all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eleni hesitated. Then she said, "I listen." That was all. She didn't accuse. She didn't exaggerate. She stated it like a fact, simple and undeniable. And in that moment, fear settled deep inside me, not fear of Darius, but fear of what Eleni had been carrying alone, because children don't speak like that unless they've been watching for a long time. I pulled her closer, wrapping my arms around her, feeling how small she was, how light, how fragile. I thought about every time I had stayed silent to keep the peace, every time I had told myself things weren't that bad. And I realized my silence hadn't protected her. It had taught her how to survive. That night, after she finally fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed her words over and over. He makes them believe what he wants. I saw Darius in a new light, not as a husband who needed control, but as a man who understood power, who understood how to bend reality without breaking it, and Eleni had seen through it. Children tell the truth in fragments because they don't have the language for lies yet. They describe what they observe, not what they assume. That's what terrified me the most. She wasn't repeating something she'd heard. She was explaining something she'd witnessed. In that silence, I understood something I can no longer ignore. If my daughter were learning to be afraid, then something in our home was deeply wrong. And for the first time, I knew that whatever came next, I couldn't pretend anymore. When Darius filed for divorce, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an ambush. There was no warning, no conversation, no attempt to resolve anything privately. One day, I was still trying to hold our fractured family together. Next, I was being served papers that turned my life into a legal battlefield. Divorce, custody, allegations, all typed neatly, as if pain could be organized into paragraphs. What stunned me most wasn't that he wanted to leave. It was that he wanted to take Eleni from me. Darius didn't ask for shared custody. He asked for full custody. And he didn't hesitate to explain why on paper in a language that felt foreign and cruel. According to him, I was unstable, emotionally unreliable, financially irresponsible. A risk. I stared at the words, trying to recognize myself in them. I couldn't. In court, he became a different man. Or maybe he was finally being exactly who he'd always been. Calm, polished, convincing. He spoke with concern in his voice. If this entire process pained him deeply, he said he only wanted what was best for our daughter. that he feared for her future if she stayed with me, and people believed him. He brought records. I had never seen before documents that painted a picture of chaos. Bank statements out of context. Dates twisted into accusations. Decisions I'd never made presented as proof of recklessness. Every piece of evidence fit perfectly into the image he wanted the court to see. A responsible father, a failing mother. I tried to defend myself, but every word felt small against his preparation. When I spoke with emotion, it was labeled as instability. When I stayed calm, it was called detachment. No response felt safe. Every reaction was used against me. I began to understand something terrifying. This wasn't a divorce. It was a strategy. Darius knew the system. He knew how credibility worked. He knew that in a courtroom, confidence often matters more than truth. And he used that knowledge with precision. He smiled at the judge. He nodded respectfully at opposing counsel. He spoke of me like a problem he regretted but had to solve. Meanwhile, I was unraveling. I barely slept. I lost weight without trying. My thoughts raced constantly, replaying every conversation, every memory, wondering how it had all been turned against me. I questioned myself the way he had taught me to. Maybe I was unstable, maybe I had failed. Maybe I didn't deserve to win. That was the most dangerous part when I started to believe him. But through all of it, Eleni watched. She sat quietly beside me in waiting rooms, her feet not quite touching the floor. She listened without interrupting, absorbing words meant for adults. When lawyers spoke about her future like a case file, she didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just listened, and she remembered. At home, she asked careful questions. Not why this was happening, but how. How courts decided things. How judges knew who was telling the truth. How people proved lies. Her curiosity wasn't childish. It was focused, intentional. I realized then that while I was breaking under the weight of it all, Eleni was collecting pieces of the truth. She noticed contradictions. She noticed how Darius's stories shifted depending on who he spoke to. She noticed how his concern disappeared the moment we were alone, and she didn't forget any of it. There were nights when I cried quietly in the bathroom so she wouldn't hear me. Nights when I stared at custody schedules like they were countdown clocks, measuring how much of my daughter's life I was about to lose. The fear was constant. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady ache in my chest that never went away. Darius called it a clean break. I knew better. This was war, dressed up as legality. And the most painful part was knowing that my child was standing in the middle of it watching. Adults twist reality, watching love turn into leverage. I wanted to shield her, but the truth was, she'd already seen too much. As the hearings continued, I felt myself fading into the background of my own story. But Eleni didn't. She stayed present. She stayed alert. She stayed silent, and in that silence, something powerful was growing. I didn't know it yet, but the very thing Darius underestimated, the quiet child in the corner, was the one who would remember everything he thought he'd erased. The day of the custody hearing felt heavier than any day I had ever lived through. The courthouse was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Every step echoed, every whisper sounded too loud. I held Elani's hand as we walked through the metal detectors, her fingers wrapped tightly around mine. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Words felt fragile there, like they could break if handled carelessly. Darius arrived confident, dressed perfectly, his posture relaxed. He nodded at people he recognized, smiled at his lawyer, and avoided looking at me. To anyone watching, he looked like a man in control of his life. I felt small beside him, worn down by months of fear and sleepless nights. When we entered the courtroom, Eleni sat beside me, her feet dangling above the floor. She looked calm, almost too calm for a child about to hear strangers decide where she would live. I leaned closer to her and whispered that everything would be okay. Though I wasn't sure I believed it myself, the hearing began the way all the others had. Darius's lawyer spoke smoothly, confidently, laying out a story I barely recognized. They talked about concern, stability, and responsibility. They talked about me as if I wasn't sitting right there. Every sentence felt like another weight placed on my chest. Then my lawyer spoke. She tried to push back, to explain, to restore balance, but it felt like swimming against a strong current. The judge listened, took notes, and asked questions. Everything moved forward with quiet efficiency. And then something happened that When I prepared for, Eleni shifted in her chair. At first, I thought she was uncomfortable. I placed my hand gently on her knee, a silent reminder to stay calm. But she straightened instead. Slowly, deliberately, I felt her hand slip out of mine. She looked up at the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I want to tell the truth," Eleni said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried across the courtroom with a clarity that made every adult freeze. I felt my heart leap into my throat. Panic rushed through me, fear that she was too young, that this was too much, that she might be ignored or dismissed. The judge leaned forward. "What truth do you want to tell?" he asked gently. Eleni swallowed, then nodded. "About my dad." I turned toward Darius without meaning to. For the first time since this battle began, I saw something crack across his face. Not anger. Not confidence. Fear. Eleni spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. She talked about things she had heard late at night, conversations she wasn't supposed to be listening to. She mentioned dates, specific ones, times, places. She described arguments that never made it into legal paperwork. She explained how stories changed depending on who was listening. Then she mentioned the recordings. A quiet murmur moved through the room. She explained how she had found them accidentally, how voices sounded different when they thought no one was paying attention, how words were used to pressure, to confuse, to control. She didn't sound emotional. She sounded precise. The judge asked questions. Eleni answered them all. I sat frozen, tears streaming down my face, unable to speak. I wanted to stop her, to protect her from this moment. But I also knew deep down that she had already carried this alone for too long. This was her way of setting it down. Darius's lawyer tried to interrupt. The judge raised his hand. Let her finish. The courtroom was silent. No shuffling. No whispering. Even the air felt still. When Eleni finished speaking, she looked at me briefly. Just for a second. Her eyes were steady, brave, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that my daughter, my quiet, observant, gentle child, had become stronger than I ever knew. Stronger than fear. Stronger than manipulation. Stronger than the man who had tried to control our reality. For the first time in months, Darius looked small. The judge called for a recess. People stood slowly, stunned. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, but I couldn't hear them. All I could see was Eleni, sitting back down beside me as if she hadn't just changed everything. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly, my hand shaking. "I'm proud of you," I whispered. She rested her head against my shoulder. "I just told what I saw," she said, and that was when I understood something I would never forget. Courage doesn't always shout, sometimes. It speaks softly and tells the truth when no one expects it. Once the words were spoken in that courtroom, there was no turning back. Truth has a way of changing the air in a room, and after Eleni spoke, everything felt different, heavier, sharper, undeniable. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now written into the official record. The investigation began quietly, but with purpose. At first, it was just questions. Requests for documents, phone calls that needed to be returned. Then, it became formal. Financial records were pulled. Timelines were examined. Voices from those recordings were compared to statements Darius had made under oath. What he once dismissed as misunderstandings began to form a pattern. A pattern he could no longer control. The charges came one by one: financial, manipulation, evidence tampering, emotional abuse. Seeing those words attached to Darius Blackwell's name felt surreal. For so long, he had been the one defining reality, deciding what was true, what was exaggerated, what was all in my head. Now, the system he had trusted to silence me was forcing him to answer questions he couldn't talk his way out of. Man who tried to paint me as weak now stood in front of the law, stripped of certainty. I was interviewed multiple times. Each session felt like reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. I had to explain moments I'd spent years trying to forget. I had to describe how control worked quietly, how it hid behind concern, how it erased confidence without ever leaving a mark. Some days I left those rooms exhausted, my voice hoarse, my hand shaking, but I kept going because Eleni was watching. She stayed close during those weeks, her presence grounding me. Sometimes she asked questions, sometimes she just sat beside me in silence, reading or drawing, as if reminding me that I wasn't alone anymore. The fear that once lived in our home had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer owned us. Darius, on the other hand, grew smaller with every update. His confidence faded. The charm that once carried him through any room couldn't survive under scrutiny. Facts don't respond to persuasion. Evidence doesn't care how convincing you sound, and for the first time, he couldn't control the narrative. There were moments when guilt tried to creep in. Moments when I wondered if I'd gone too far. If this was too much for Eleni, if exposing the truth had cost her something she could never get back. Those thoughts haunted me late at night when the house was skeet. In my mind had room to wander. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Eleni leaned into me and spoke softly. "Mom," she said, "telling the truth is hard." I nodded, unable to disagree. "But staying quiet is harder," she continued. Her words settled deep inside me. She wasn't repeating something she'd heard. She was speaking from experience. From months of watching, listening, and holding things she shouldn't have had to carry. In that moment, I understood the true weight of truth. It isn't just about exposure. It's about responsibility. Once you see what's wrong, once you understand the damage silence causes, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to pretending. Truth demands something from you. The investigation moved forward, and with it, a strange sense of relief, not joy, not victory, relief, like finally setting down something heavy you'd been carrying for too long. I stopped questioning my memory. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Slowly, carefully, I began to reclaim parts of myself I didn't realize I'd lost. I watched Eleni change too. The fear in her eyes softened. She laughed more freely. She slept through the night again. Each small sign of healing felt like confirmation that we had done the right thing. The truth had shaken our lives, but it had also steadied them. Darius Blackwell no longer stood above us. He stood where he always should have been, accountable. And as the process continued, I realized something powerful. Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing honesty even when it feels unbearable, because once the truth is spoken, its weight may be heavy, but it also sets you free. The day the judge announced the final decision, I felt time slow down in a way I didn't think was possible. The courtroom was quiet, almost respectful, as if it understood the weight of what was about to be said. I held Eleni's hand, her fingers warm and steady in mine. She looked up at me once, searching my face, and I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. I was terrified to hope. When the judge awarded me full custody, the words didn't register immediately. They floated in the air, distant and unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. It wasn't until I felt Eleni squeeze my hand hard that it became real. We had won. Not just custody, not just a legal decision, we had won our lives back. I didn't cry right away. I sat there, breathing slowly, letting the truth settle into my bones. Months of fear, doubt, and silence began to loosen their grip. The woman who had walked into that courtroom unsure of her own reality was not the woman who walked out. For the first time in a long time, I felt solid. Outside the courthouse, the sky was bright, painfully blue, like the world had moved on while we were fighting to survive inside it. Eleni stepped into the sunlight and smiled a real smile, unguarded and free. That single moment was worth everything we had endured. We went home to a quiet house. No tension in the air. No careful listening for footsteps. Just space. Just peace. That night, Eleni fell asleep quickly, without fear, without questions. I sat at the edge of her bed for a long time, watching her breathe, memorizing the safety of that moment. Only then did I allow myself to cry. Not tears of anger. Not tears of revenge. Tears of release. I thought about the woman I had been when this all began, the one who doubted herself, who mistook control for care, who stayed silent to keep the peace. I didn't judge her anymore. She had survived the only way she knew how. But I was no longer her. I had found my voice. Rebuilding wasn't instant. Healing never is. There were still days when memories surfaced without warning, when I questioned decisions, when the past felt too close. But fear no longer ruled me. I no longer measured my words to avoid conflict. I no longer needed permission to exist fully, and neither did my daughter. Eleni grew lighter, more open. She laughed loudly again. She asked questions without hesitation. She trusted her instincts. Watching her reclaim her childhood was the greatest victory of all. It reminded me why I had fought so hard not to win. But to protect the truth, this story was never about revenge. It was about survival. It was about recognizing manipulation when it wears the mask of love. About understanding that silence, no matter how peaceful it seems, can slowly erase you. It was about motherhood, not just in the act of protecting a child, but in modeling courage, honesty, and resilience. I didn't become brave overnight. Courage arrived in pieces, through fear, through doubt, through a child's quiet strength. It arrived when I chose truth even when it felt unsafe. It arrived when I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from my confusion. And now, standing on the other side of it all, I know this. My voice matters. My story matters, and silence is no longer my home. I am Nyla Reavers. I am a mother. I'm a survivor, and I broke the silence not just for myself, but for anyone who is still afraid to speak.